The luxurious jewelry store glittered under soft lighting that danced across polished glass and shimmering jewels. Amelia stood silently, her deep brown eyes wide as she admired the sparkling necklaces, rings, and earrings nestled inside the display cases. At just 11 years old, she was small for her age, her long braids cascading over her shoulders. Despite her quiet nature, she was filled with wonder each time she visited the shop. Shopping with her father on previous visits to this store wasn't just any store, it belonged to her father. Yet, even though she had been here countless times, it still felt magical, like stepping into a world of endless treasures. She often wandered through the aisles after school while her father worked in the back office, managing the business. Today, however, her father wasn't there. He had left for a meeting, trusting Amelia to explore the showroom while he was away. She didn't mind being alone, the jewelry always captivated her, and she felt a sense of peace just being near the sparkling gems. But today, that peace would be shattered in a way she never could have imagined. As Amelia wandered from case to case, her fingers lightly tracing the smooth glass, she noticed someone watching her. Glancing up, she saw Miss White, a tall, stern-faced saleswoman who had recently joined the staff. The woman's piercing eyes were locked on Amelia, her expression cold and suspicious. Miss White rarely interacted with her, even when Amelia's father was around, and her presence always made the girl uneasy. Amelia tried to shake off the unsettling feeling, focusing instead on the dazzling displays. A particular pair of diamond earrings caught her eye, tiny, intricate, and sparkling like tiny stars. She leaned closer, her small face nearly touching the glass, mesmerized by their beauty. But then it happened. Her hand, resting near the edge of the case, accidentally brushed against the delicate stand holding the earrings. One of them wobbled, slipped free, and tumbled to the floor with a soft clink. Amelia's heart raced. She crouched down, her hands trembling, reaching for the fallen earring. Before her fingers could even touch it, a sharp voice cut through the air. "What do you think you're doing?" Miss White barked, her tone sharp enough to make Amelia flinch. The girl looked up, her wide eyes filled with fear. I'm sorry," Amelia stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to drop it." Miss White's lips curled into a sneer. "Didn't mean to drop it, or didn't mean to steal it?" she snapped, her words dripping with accusation. Amelia's breath hitched. "No, I wasn't trying to steal it. It was an accident," she protested, her voice trembling. But her words seemed to fall on deaf ears. Seconds later, Caroline fell asleep, and though she slept, Amelia thought she must be with her. Miss White loomed over her, her face twisted with disdain. "I knew it the moment you walked in here," she spat. "People like you don't belong in a place like this. You thought you could just take whatever you wanted, didn't you?" Tears welled up in Amelia's eyes. "No, I swear I wasn't." Her plea was interrupted by a sharp slap across her face. The sound rang out in the quiet store, and Amelia stumbled backward, clutching her stinging cheek. The force of the blow sent her sprawling onto the cold marble floor, her small frame crumpling as tears streamed down her face. She lay there, stunned and motionless, as the pain and fear coursed through her. Miss White stood above her, her hand still raised, a look of cruel satisfaction in her eyes. It was as if she had been waiting for this moment, a chance to vent her hatred and power over someone she deemed powerless. Amelia whimpered, her tiny body trembling as she struggled to process what had just happened. The slap stung, but the humiliation and fear cut deeper. She wanted to run, to disappear, but she was frozen in place. Miss White crouched slightly, her voice low and venomous. "You're nothing but a little thief," she hissed, "and thieves get what's coming to them." Amelia opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Miss White straightened, pulled out her phone and dialed with practiced ease. Her voice, calm and composed, contrasted sharply with the violence she had just unleashed. "Yes, this is an emergency," she said smoothly. "I need to report an attempted theft at our jewelry store. A young girl tried to steal a diamond earring. Yes, I've restrained her. Please send someone right away." Amelia's heart sank as she listened, her tears falling silently. The nightmare was just beginning. Amelia's chest tightened as her heart sank. The police? The word echoed in her mind, disbelief mixing with a raw sense of fear. She hadn't done anything wrong. She wasn't trying to steal. It was all just a horrible accident. But Miss White wasn't listening, and now the police were on their way. "Please," Amelia whimpered, trying to sit up as her small frame trembled. "It was an accident. I didn't mean to—" "Be quiet," Miss White snapped, her sharp tone cutting through the air like a blade. Her glare bore down on the girl, her lips curled with disdain. "I don't want to hear your lies. Let the police handle you." Amelia's body shook as she hugged her knees to her chest. Quiet sobs racked her, tears spilling down her cheeks in endless streams. Never in her short life had she felt so small, so powerless. The sound of the store's door chime broke the heavy silence, and two officers walked in, their imposing figures casting long shadows under the fluorescent lights. Their uniforms were spotless, their faces unreadable. One glance at Amelia, crumpled on the floor with tears streaking her face, and they turned to Miss White. "She's the one," Miss White said with a triumphant sneer, her voice dripping with false righteousness. "That little thief tried to take one of our diamond earrings. I caught her red-handed." The officers exchanged brief looks, their expressions hardening, before one of them stepped toward Amelia. He crouched in front of her, his cold, penetrating gaze locking onto her tear-filled eyes. "Is this true, young lady? Did you try to steal that earring?" he asked, his voice devoid of sympathy. Amelia frantically shook her head, her small voice trembling as she pleaded. "No, I didn't. It was an accident. I wasn't trying to steal it, I swear." The officer's face remained emotionless, his tone firm. "You're coming with us." Several seconds passed. "What? No, please! I didn't do anything," Amelia cried, her voice cracking with desperation. But the second officer didn't hesitate. He grabbed her arm, his grip rough and unyielding, and pulled her to her feet. "Wait, stop, you're hurting me," she gasped, but her words were ignored. Her hands were wrenched behind her back, and the cold, unyielding bite of metal snapped around her small wrists. The sound of the handcuffs locking into place seemed to echo endlessly in her ears. Amelia felt her knees weaken beneath her. The cuffs were heavy and tight, cutting into her skin. This couldn't be real. It had to be a nightmare. She tried to pull away, her voice rising in panic. "No, please, I didn't steal anything." Her cries were met with indifference. The officers began dragging her toward the door, their grip unrelenting as her small legs stumbled to keep up. She twisted her head, searching for mercy in Miss White's eyes, but all she found was a cold smirk of satisfaction, as though the woman relished the chaos she had caused. Outside, the police car gleamed under the harsh sunlight, its doors flung open as the officers shoved her inside. The door slammed behind her, the sound reverberating through the enclosed space. Amelia sat hunched in the back seat, her whole body shaking as tears fell unchecked. The cuffs pinched at her wrists every time she moved, a cruel reminder of her helplessness. The car rumbled to life, speeding down the busy streets as Amelia stared blankly out of the window. The blur of buildings and people outside seemed surreal, like the backdrop of a world that no longer made sense. Her mind raced, her chest heaving with shallow breaths, as she fought to make sense of what had just happened. How had this spiraled so far out of control? All she'd wanted was to admire the earrings, and now she was being treated like a criminal? The city scaped past her by, but she barely noticed. Her thoughts churned with fear. Would they take her to jail? Would she be locked away forever? She didn't belong here, in the back seat of a police car, treated like someone dangerous. Finally, the car screeched to a stop. Amelia blinked, startled back to reality as the officer opened the door, his hand gripping her arm tightly as he yanked her out. "Let's go," he ordered, his voice curt. Amelia stumbled as her feet hit the pavement, the sudden motion jarring her aching wrists. She looked up and saw Miss White standing there, the same self-satisfied smirk plastered across her face. "I told you she's a thief," Miss White declared with a smug air of authority. "I caught her red-handed trying to take one of our diamond earrings. Calling you was the right thing to do." Amelia's voice caught in her throat. Her small, tear-streaked face turned toward the officers, desperate for someone, anyone, to believe her. But all she saw was indifference. The nightmare was far from over. The officer gripping Amelia's arm gave a curt nod. "We'll handle it," he said firmly. Amelia's stomach twisted in knots. They believed her. They actually believed Miss White, even though nothing she said was true. The weight of their judgment bore down on Amelia, suffocating her with the injustice of it all. One officer knelt, leveling his steely gaze with Amelia's tear-filled eyes. "You need to be honest, young lady," he said in a tone laced with accusation. "Did you take the earring?" "No," Amelia cried, her voice trembling with desperation. She shook her head vigorously, the tears spilling faster now. "It was an accident. I didn't mean to drop it, I swear." But her words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The officer straightened, his expression unchanging, while his partner exchanged a glance with Ms. White. The saleswoman nodded with satisfaction, crossing her arms. "Typical," she muttered under her breath. "They always say that." Amelia's heart plummeted further, the sense of hopelessness closing in around her. No one believed her. It was as if her voice didn't matter, like they had already decided she was guilty and nothing she said would make a difference. The officer who had questioned her turned to his partner. "Let's take her back inside and get this sorted." Back inside? Amelia's pulse quickened. She didn't want to go back in there, not to face the stares, the humiliation. But before she could protest, the officers hauled her to her feet, their grips firm as they guided her toward the store. Her small feet dragged against the pavement, her legs barely able to keep up with their strides. The jewelry store was unchanged, the lights still gleaming brightly, the glass cases still immaculate. But to Amelia it felt alien now, a cold, unwelcoming place that had transformed from wonder to dread. The sparkling gems seemed to mock her, their shine a cruel contrast to her despair. Ms. White followed close behind, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. Each step echoed ominously, making Amelia's stomach churn. One officer gestured to a stool near the front counter. "Sit here," he barked. He pressed a heavy hand on her shoulder, forcing her into the seat. Amelia sat stiffly, her back rigid, her whole body taut with fear. Her wrists ached from the handcuffs, and tears blurred her vision, but she couldn't look away as Miss White launched into her version of the story. "She's been in here before," Miss White began, her voice dripping with disdain. "I've seen her wandering around, always eyeing the jewelry. I just knew she was up to no good." Her words were poison, each one twisting the truth further. The officers listened intently, their pens scratching against notepads as they took her statement. Amelia's chest tightened as she watched the lies pile higher, burying her under the weight of an accusation she couldn't escape. Suddenly, the chime of the store's door echoed through the room. Amelia's head snapped up, her heart leaping into her throat. It was her father. He walked in calmly at first, his broad shoulders steady and composed, but as his eyes swept over the scene, his daughter sitting in handcuffs, her tear-streaked face frozen in fear, the officers towering over her, his expression darkened. A storm brewed in his gaze, and his calm exterior cracked to reveal a smoldering anger. "What is going on here?" Mr. Johnson's voice was low, measured, but edged with fury. The entire room seemed to still at the weight of his words. Miss White turned to him, her smug smile plastered on her face. "Oh, Mr. Johnson, I'm glad you're here. I've taken care of everything." She gestured dismissively toward Amelia, not even sparing her a glance. "This girl was caught trying to steal one of our diamond earrings. I called the police and they've got it under control now." Mr. Johnson's gaze flicked between the officers and his daughter, who sat trembling on the stool, her eyes wide with terror. His jaw clenched, and a dangerous calm overtook him. "This girl," he said, his voice chillingly cold, "is my daughter." Miss White's smile faltered, the confidence draining from her face. "What?" she stammered, her voice cracking. I didn't know." She scrambled to her feet. Mr. Johnson stepped closer, his towering presence forcing her to take a step back. His fists clenched tightly at his sides, his rage barely contained. "My daughter," he repeated, his voice sharp and venomous. "And you called the police on her? Accused her of stealing in my store?" Miss White stumbled backward, her face pale, as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. I didn't know, sir. I thought—" "Don't!" Mr. Johnson snapped, cutting her off with a glare that could pierce steel. He turned to the officers, his voice commanding, "Take those handcuffs off her, now!" The officers hesitated, exchanging uneasy glances. "Sir, we were just following protocol based on the accusations," one of them said cautiously. "I said take them off," Mr. Johnson commanded, his voice sharp and unwavering. His patience had evaporated. The officers, now clearly uncomfortable, scrambled to comply. One of them quickly produced a key, unlocking the handcuffs and freeing Amelia from their cold, unyielding grip. As soon as her wrists were free, Amelia instinctively rubbed them, her small fingers gingerly tracing the red marks left behind. She looked up at her father with wide, tear-filled eyes, a mix of relief and lingering fear. Mr. Johnson knelt in front of her, his hard expression softening as he gently touched her cheek. "Are you okay, baby girl?" he asked quietly, his tone tender and full of concern. Amelia nodded, though her voice was too shaky to respond. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she threw her arms around him, burying her face in his chest. She sobbed softly, her tiny body trembling as she clung to the only person who made her feel safe. Mr. Johnson held her tightly, his rage momentarily set aside as he comforted his daughter. His large hand stroked her back in soothing circles, his heart breaking at the sight of her distress. The tender moment didn't last long. Mr. Johnson stood, his full height towering over everyone in the room as his eyes locked onto Ms. White. His expression darkened and his anger simmered dangerously close to the surface. "You're fired," he said, his voice cold and final. "Get out of my store." Ms. White froze, her face draining of color. She opened her mouth to protest, but the words caught in her throat when she saw the look in his eyes. It was a look that left no room for negotiation. She nodded weakly, her hands trembling as she turned to leave. Her heels clicked hesitantly on the floor as she walked toward the door, her head hanging low in shame. Before she could exit, one of the officers spoke up. "Mr. Johnson, we can't let her leave just yet," he said, glancing between him and Miss White. "There's been an accusation, and we still need to investigate." "There's nothing to investigate," Mr. Johnson snapped, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "You've done enough damage already." Miss White paused near the door, her hand clutching her phone so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her mind raced as she processed the gravity of her actions. She had accused a child, slapped her, and called the police, all without a shred of real evidence. And now, to her horror, she realized that child was her boss's daughter. The regret gnawed at her, but it was too late to undo what she had done. She fumbled with her phone, her fingers trembling as she tried to keep her composure. Dialing Mr. Johnson's number had felt like the right move earlier, a way to position herself as the diligent employee protecting his store. But now it felt like a mistake, one she couldn't take back. Her heart pounded as the phone rang in her ear, each second stretching painfully long. When Mr. Johnson's deep voice answered, her stomach churned. "Mr. Johnson, speaking." Miss White straightened her back, forcing her voice into a tone of confidence she didn't feel. "Mr. Johnson, it's Miss White, sir. I wanted to inform you that there's been a situation at the store today." His voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it that made her feel as if she were treading on thin ice. "A situation?" he repeated. "Yes, sir," she said, swallowing hard. "A young girl came in and, well, she attempted to steal a diamond earring from one of the displays. I caught her in the act and called the police. They're here now handling the matter. I wanted to ensure you were informed immediately." There was a pause, the kind that made her chest tighten with anxiety. Then, Mr. Johnson's voice came through again, slow and deliberate. "You caught a thief?" "Yes, sir," she replied, trying to sound professional. "She's about 11 years old. I noticed her acting suspiciously around the displays. When she dropped one of the earrings, I confronted her. She got defensive, and I had no choice but to call the police." Ms. White could hear him exhale sharply on the other end, and her grip on the phone tightened. "Good work, Miss White," Mr. Johnson said finally, his tone regaining its calm authority. "You did the right thing by calling the police. I appreciate you keeping an eye on the store. Security is a priority, and I'll make sure you're rewarded for your diligence." Relief washed over her like a wave, and she allowed herself a small smile. "Thank you, sir. I just wanted to ensure everything was taken care of." "I'm on my way there now," Mr. Johnson continued. "I'll handle the situation personally." Miss White's confidence grew, bolstered by what she perceived as his approval. Her earlier anxiety faded, replaced by a sense of victory. She had made the right call, and her boss seemed impressed. Perhaps this would even earn her a bonus. "Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I'll await your arrival," she said, her voice laced with gratitude. She hung up the phone and turned back to face the officers, her smirk returning as she prepared to resume her narrative. Little did she know, her actions had set the stage for a confrontation she wasn't prepared for. The faintest trace of a smirk lingered on Miss White's face as she spoke. "Mr. Johnson is on his way now. He's been informed of everything." The officers exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier resolve seeming to waver. It was clear they weren't entirely sure how to proceed, as though they sensed something was off but couldn't pinpoint what it was. Miss White, however, ignored their hesitation and turned her attention back to Amelia. The girl sat still on the stool, her tear-streaked face pale and her small frame trembling. For a brief moment, Miss White hesitated. A flicker of doubt crossed her mind. Had she overreacted? But she quickly brushed it aside, convincing herself she had done the right thing. After all, she was protecting the store and following protocol. She straightened her posture, confident that Mr. Johnson would back her up. The minutes dragged on, each second stretching longer than the last. The tension in the store grew thicker with every passing moment. The officers stood silently nearby, occasionally glancing at each other as if silently questioning their own involvement. Despite their discomfort, they made no move to release Amelia or investigate further, content to leave the matter for Mr. Johnson to address when he arrived. Then the door to the store swung open. Mr. Johnson walked in, his tall and commanding figure instantly dominating the room. Dressed in a crisp, tailored suit, he exuded authority with every step. His sharp eyes scanned the scene, the officers standing uneasily, Ms. White's falsely confident posture, and finally, his daughter sitting on the stool, her small wrists red from the handcuffs. For a brief moment, confusion flickered across Mr. Johnson's face as he processed the scene before him. But the instant he noticed the handcuffs on Amelia's wrists, his expression hardened into one of pure fury. "What the hell is going on here?" His voice cut through the air, sharp and demanding, leaving no room for hesitation. Miss White froze, the confident explanation she had rehearsed crumbling in her mind. "Sir, this girl," she began, but her words faltered as Mr. Johnson's piercing gaze landed on her, silencing her instantly. He turned to Amelia, his voice softening but carrying an undercurrent of urgency. "Amelia?" he asked, his brow furrowing. "What happened?" Amelia looked up at her father, tears spilling over as she spoke. "Daddy, I didn't do anything. I swear, I didn't steal anything." Hearing his daughter's trembling voice, and seeing the fear in her eyes, Mr. Johnson's jaw tightened. He turned back to Miss White, his expression cold and menacing. "What did you do?" he demanded, his voice low and filled with restrained anger. Miss White stammered, her earlier composure completely gone. Sir, I thought I saw her drop the earring, and I assumed—" "You assumed?" Mr. Johnson interrupted, his voice dangerously calm. "You assumed my daughter was a thief?" Miss White's face paled as the realization of her mistake fully sank in. "I didn't know she was your daughter," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You didn't know," Mr. Johnson repeated, each word heavy with contempt. He turned to the officers, his tone sharp and commanding. "Take those handcuffs off my daughter, now." The officers, startled by the authority in his voice, quickly moved to comply. One of them fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking slightly as he unlocked the cuffs. Amelia winced as the metal restraints were removed, her small wrists red and raw. As soon as she was free, Amelia ran to her father, throwing her arms around him and burying her face in his chest. Mr. Johnson held her tightly, his anger momentarily softened by the need to comfort his daughter. He looked over her head at Miss White, his expression hardening once more. "You accused my daughter of stealing," he said slowly, his tone icy. "You called the police on her. You put handcuffs on her." Miss White could only nod, her throat tight with fear. I thought," she stammered again, her words trailing off. "You thought wrong," Mr. Johnson said coldly, his voice dripping with controlled fury. "You're fired. Get out of my store." Miss White's face crumpled in panic. "Please, sir, I didn't mean—" "I said get out," Mr. Johnson snapped, his voice like thunder. Miss White didn't wait for him to repeat himself. She turned and hurried toward the door, her steps quick and unsteady as she fled the store, leaving the officers and Amelia's father behind. Miss White lingered near the door for a brief moment, her shoulders slumping as she turned and hurried out, her head low in shame. The sound of her heels clicking against the floor faded as the door swung shut behind her. The two officers stood frozen, exchanging awkward glances. It was clear they felt the weight of their actions, or lack thereof, hanging heavily in the room. Mr. Johnson's gaze shifted to the officers, his eyes sharp and unyielding. "I don't care what she told you," he said, his voice steady but laced with cold fury. "My daughter didn't steal anything. This was all a mistake, and you owe her an apology." The officers hesitated, their discomfort plain. Finally, one of them stepped forward, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Mr. Johnson, we're sorry," he said awkwardly. "We were just acting on the report we got. We didn't realize—" "You didn't realize?" Mr. Johnson interrupted, his tone cutting like a blade. "You didn't even bother to check the facts. You just assumed." The officer swallowed hard, his voice faltering. "We didn't mean any harm, sir." "Get out." The words were quiet, but carried an undeniable force. The officers didn't argue, they nodded stiffly and left the store quickly, their footsteps heavy with guilt. The door closed behind them with a faint thud, leaving the store eerily quiet, the tension still hanging thick in the air. Mr. Johnson remained standing in place, his chest rising and falling as he exhaled deeply. His anger hadn't subsided, but now it mingled with a sense of relief that Amelia was safe. He looked down at his daughter, who clung tightly to his arm, her small frame trembling. Kneeling to meet her gaze, he gently brushed a tear from her cheek. "Are you okay, baby girl?" he asked, his voice soft and tender, a stark contrast to the sharp tone he'd used just moments earlier. Amelia nodded faintly, but her eyes remained filled with fear. Her hands fidgeted with the hem of her shirt, and the red marks from the handcuffs on her small wrists made Mr. Johnson's stomach twist painfully. "I didn't take anything, Daddy," she whispered, her voice so quiet it was almost inaudible. "It was an accident. I didn't mean to drop the earring." He placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, his anger flaring once again, not at her, but at what she had been forced to endure. "I know, sweetheart. I know you didn't do anything wrong," he assured her. "Ah, no." Straightening, Mr. Johnson turned his gaze toward the door where Miss White had disappeared. The full weight of the situation hit him like a storm. His employee, a woman he had trusted enough to work in his store, had accused his daughter, his own child, of theft. Worse, she had called the police, had put his daughter in handcuffs, and had humiliated her in the very store that was supposed to be a safe space. The anger bubbled up inside him once more, but he held it back. Amelia needed him to stay composed, to be the steady presence she could rely on. Taking a deep breath, he gently guided her over to the counter. "Stay here for a moment, okay?" he said softly, brushing another tear from her cheek. "I'll take care of everything." Drawing forth a pendant affording her freedom, he tied the strings in his belt. Amelia nodded again, her wide eyes following him as he stepped away. She sat down, still trembling, her small hands clasped tightly in her lap. Mr. Johnson paced the floor, his mind racing. He replayed the events of the last hour, the humiliation his daughter had endured, and the part Miss White had played in it. This wasn't just about one woman's ignorance or prejudice. This was about a larger problem. The police had acted without question, without checking the facts, and it was Amelia who had paid the price for their assumptions. Before he could gather his thoughts completely, the door to the store opened again. Miss White stepped back inside, her face pale and her posture hesitant. The smug confidence she had displayed earlier was gone, replaced by a nervous energy that betrayed her fear. She stood in the doorway, clasping her hands tightly in front of her, as though bracing herself for what was to come. Mr. Johnson's eyes locked onto hers, his expression hard and unyielding. The air between them seemed to thicken with tension. "What are you doing here?" he asked coldly, his voice steady but carrying an edge that made Miss White flinch. I came back to explain," she stammered, her voice trembling. "Mr. Johnson, I swear, I didn't know she was your daughter. If I had known—" "If you had known—" Mr. Johnson's tone turned sharper, cutting her off mid-sentence. Miss White's hands tightened their grip on each other as she stood frozen under his glare, unable to continue. Mr. Johnson cut her off sharply, his voice rising just enough to show his simmering fury. "That's your excuse? Are you telling me that if it had been another little black girl, someone else's child, Your actions would have been justified? Ms. White's face drained of color, and she fumbled for words, her composure unraveling. No, no, sir. That's not what I meant. I thought I was protecting the store. Protecting the store? Mr. Johnson repeated, disbelief etched in every word. By striking an innocent child? By calling the police over an accident? Do you even hear how ridiculous that sounds? Miss White's cheeks turned a deep shade of red as her gaze flicked to Amelia, who was sitting quietly near the counter, her face still streaked with tears. The sight of the young girl only deepened the weight of Miss White's guilt. I'm sorry, Mr. Johnson, she stammered, her voice shaky and faint. I was wrong. I shouldn't have. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Mr. Johnson's jaw tightened, his restraint hanging by a thread. It's far too late for apologies, he said coldly. You crossed a line, one you can never uncross. Your prejudice blinded you to the truth, and my daughter suffered for it. Miss White opened her mouth to speak again, but Mr. Johnson raised a firm hand, cutting her off. You're fired, he said decisively. I want you out of my store immediately. Don't expect a reference or a single penny more from me. You've done enough harm. Tears welled in Ms. White's eyes, her earlier confidence crumbling into desperation. Please, sir, she pleaded, her voice breaking. I can't lose this job. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I just thought. I don't want to hear your excuses, Mr. Johnson snapped, his patience gone. You should have thought about the consequences before treating my daughter like a criminal. Miss White hesitated, her lips trembling as she searched for a final appeal, but the weight of the situation finally crushed her resolve. Her shoulders slumped in defeat, and she nodded weakly. I'm sorry, she whispered one last time before turning toward the door. As her trembling hand reached for the handle, the door swung open suddenly, and the two police officers from earlier stepped back inside. Their expressions were grim, their demeanor serious, as they looked around the room. Mr. Johnson, one of the officers said, his voice cautious but steady, we've received instructions from headquarters. We need to take a formal statement about the incident involving your daughter. Mr. Johnson's eyebrows rose slightly, his anger momentarily tempered by curiosity. A formal statement? He repeated. The officer nodded, his gaze shifting to Miss White. Yes, sir, there's been an official complaint of assault against a minor, and we need to investigate. We'll need a statement from the employee involved. Miss White's face turned ashen and she stumbled back a step, her hands shaking. Assault? She stammered, her voice barely audible. I didn't mean to. Please, I was just. But the officers didn't wait for her to finish. One stepped forward, pulling out a pair of handcuffs, while the other began reading her rights in a calm, authoritative tone. Miss White, you're under arrest for assaulting a minor. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Miss White gasped, her face contorted with fear as her eyes darted toward Mr. Johnson. Please, sir, she begged, her voice trembling. I didn't mean to hurt her. It was a misunderstanding, I swear. Mr. Johnson's expression remained cold and unyielding as he watched the officers cuff her hands. He said nothing, his silence speaking volumes as Miss White's pleas grew quieter. The officers led her toward the door, their movements swift and businesslike. As she reached the threshold, Miss White turned back one last time, her pale face marked with regret. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The door closed behind them with a firm click, and the store fell into an uneasy silence. Mr. Johnson stood still for a moment, exhaling deeply. A strange sense of closure washed over him, but it did little to ease the lingering pain. Justice had been served, but it hadn't erased what Amelia had endured. He turned back to his daughter, who had watched the entire scene with wide, tearful eyes. Gently, he knelt down beside her, his face softening as he met her gaze. Is she gone? Amelia asked quietly, her voice small and uncertain. Mr. Johnson nodded, brushing a strand of hair from her face. She's gone, he said gently. And she won't hurt you again. Amelia bit her lip, her trembling hands clutching her father's. The fear lingered, but in her father's presence, she felt a small spark of safety return. Daddy, I was so scared, Amelia whispered, her voice trembling as fresh tears streamed down her cheeks. Mr. Johnson pulled her into his arms. holding her tightly as she buried her face against his chest. "I know, baby girl," he said softly, his voice full of both sorrow and reassurance. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that, but it's over now. You're safe." As he held her close, the weight of the day finally began to ease, though the anger in his chest still burned hot. His daughter was safe, and Miss White was now facing the consequences of her actions. It wasn't the perfect ending, but it was enough for now. The store remained eerily quiet, the tension of the ordeal lingering like a heavy fog. Mr. Johnson stayed close to Amelia, his protective hand resting on her shoulder. He could feel her small body trembling against him, and the thought of her enduring such cruelty filled him with both heartbreak and fury. At least justice seemed to have begun its course. Miss White had been arrested, and the officers were now treating the situation with the gravity it deserved. But the memory of their initial actions, their blind acceptance of Miss White's lies, was a wound that would take longer to heal. Mr. Johnson crouched down in front of Amelia, his voice gentle as he asked, "Are you sure you're okay, sweetheart?" He reached up, brushing away a tear that had slipped down her cheek. Amelia nodded weakly, her voice still shaky. "I'm okay now, Daddy, but I was so scared. I thought they were going to take me to jail." Her voice broke as she spoke the words, her fear still fresh. Mr. Johnson's chest tightened, his anger surging again. The thought of his innocent daughter being treated like a criminal was unbearable. "No one is ever taking you anywhere," he said firmly, his voice steady and protective. "You didn't do anything wrong, Amelia, and I won't let anyone hurt you like that ever again." She gave a small nod, wiping her eyes with trembling hands. She clung to him as though afraid the nightmare might start all over if she let go. Mr. Johnson held her just as tightly, his determination hardening. This wasn't just about protecting Amelia today. It was about ensuring nothing like this ever happened again, not to her or anyone else. The door to the stores swung open again, breaking the heavy silence. A new figure walked in, an officer in plain clothes, whose calm yet authoritative presence immediately commanded attention. His face was stern but not unfriendly. Behind him, the two uniformed officers from earlier followed, their demeanor noticeably more subdued. "Mr. Johnson," the plainclothes officer said, stepping forward and extending a hand, "I'm Lieutenant Harris. I've been assigned to oversee the investigation into what happened here today." Mr. Johnson straightened, shaking Harris's hand firmly, though his expression remained guarded. "I appreciate that, Lieutenant," he said, his voice even but resolute. "But I want to make one thing clear. My daughter was falsely accused, assaulted, and humiliated, all because of a racist employee who let her prejudice dictate her actions. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, this was prejudice, plain and simple." Lieutenant Harris nodded, his gaze briefly flicking to Amelia before returning to Mr. Johnson. "I understand your concern, sir, and I assure you we're taking this very seriously. Miss White is in custody, and we're gathering statements to ensure the appropriate charges are filed." Mr. Johnson folded his arms across his chest, his tone hardening. "That's not enough. I want accountability from everyone involved in this, including your officers." He gestured toward the two uniformed policemen standing behind Harris. "They didn't just take her word for it. They acted on it without giving my daughter even the slightest chance to defend herself." The officers shifted uneasily, clearly aware of the weight of their actions. One of them, Officer Reynolds, stepped forward, his expression tight with regret. "Mr. Johnson, we're deeply sorry for how things unfolded. We were responding to the call as it came in, and—" "Responding to the call?" Mr. Johnson interrupted, disbelief sharpening his tone. "You put an 11-year-old girl in handcuffs. You believed every word that woman said without so much as asking my daughter for her side of the story. How is that responding?" The second officer, Officer Park, cleared his throat and added hesitantly, "It wasn't our intention to escalate things like this, sir. We were following protocol based on the accusations made." "And those accusations were lies," Mr. Johnson snapped, his voice ringing through the store. "Protocol doesn't excuse failing to use your judgment or common sense. You looked at my daughter, an innocent child, and decided she was guilty without even thinking. That is not acceptable." Reynolds and Park exchanged an uncomfortable glance, clearly at a loss for words. Lieutenant Harris stepped in, his tone calm but firm. "You're right, Mr. Johnson. There's no excuse for what happened here. I'll make sure this is addressed in our internal review, and I promise you there will be consequences." Mr. Johnson nodded, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. Good. Because this wasn't just a mistake. This was a failure, by Ms. White, by your officers, and by the system that allowed this to happen in the first place. And I won't stand for it. Mr. Johnson's voice was sharp as he said, "You didn't even try to find out the truth." Son. Lieutenant Harris stepped forward, raising a hand to calm the situation. "I understand your frustration, Mr. Johnson, and I assure you this will be thoroughly investigated. We'll be reviewing the body cam footage from both officers and conducting an internal review. You have my word that there will be consequences if any mishandling of protocol is uncovered." Mr. Johnson's eyes narrowed. "This isn't just about protocol, Lieutenant. It's about basic decency and common sense. My daughter was treated like a criminal because of the color of her skin, and your officers didn't think twice before believing it." Harris didn't flinch under Mr. Johnson's piercing gaze. "And that's exactly why we're conducting a full investigation, sir. I can promise you that this will not be ignored." The two men stood facing each other for a moment, the tension thick in the air. Finally, Mr. Johnson exhaled, his shoulders easing just slightly. He could see the sincerity in Harris's eyes, but it didn't ease the sting of what his daughter had endured. "Fine," Mr. Johnson said at last, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "But I want full transparency throughout this process. I expect to be informed every step of the way." "Of course," Harris assured him. "I'll personally oversee the investigation and ensure you receive regular updates." Mr. Johnson nodded, though the ache in his chest remained. "Good." The officer stood quietly for a moment, then Harris turned his attention to Amelia. His expression softened, his voice gentle. "Miss Johnson, I'm very sorry for what you went through today. No child should ever experience something like this. We'll make sure this is handled properly." Amelia looked up at him, her wide eyes still clouded with fear and uncertainty. She didn't speak, but she gave a small nod, her tiny hand clinging tightly to her father's. With that, Lieutenant Harris gestured to the two uniformed officers, signaling for them to leave. As they reached the door, Officer Reynolds hesitated. He turned back toward Mr. Johnson, his face shadowed with regret. "Mr. Johnson, I'm truly sorry," he said quietly. "I know it doesn't undo what happened, but I need you to know that I regret my actions." Mr. Johnson's expression remained unreadable for a long moment. Finally, he gave a curt nod. "Just make sure it doesn't happen again." Reynolds nodded solemnly before stepping out of the store with his partner. The door closed behind them, leaving the store in a heavy silence once again. Mr. Johnson looked down at Amelia, who still clung to his side, her small fingers gripping his sleeve like a lifeline. His heart ached for her, for the fear and pain she had endured. No child should ever have to go through what she had. He knelt beside her, gently cupping her face in his hands. "We're going to be okay," he said softly, his voice filled with quiet determination. "I promise you, this won't happen again." Amelia's wide eyes searched his face, and for the first time since the ordeal began, a small, tentative smile broke through. "Thank you for protecting me, Daddy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mr. Johnson's heart swelled with love and pride as he pulled her into a warm embrace. "Always, baby girl," he whispered. "Always." As they stood there in the quiet of the store, Mr. Johnson made a silent vow. This wouldn't just be another incident, another injustice brushed aside. He would fight. Not just for Amelia, but for every child who might face the same cruelty. He would ensure that Miss White, the officers, and anyone else who had failed his daughter would face accountability. This was only the beginning, and Mr. Johnson was prepared to see it through, no matter how long it took. Justice wasn't just a word. It was a promise he intended to keep. Amelia had returned to school, doing her best to move forward, but Mr. Johnson could still see the unease in her eyes. Every time the store's door chimed as a customer entered, she flinched slightly. The fear wasn't something she could easily forget, and Mr. Johnson knew that while he could protect her now, the scars from that day would take time to heal. The investigation into Miss White's actions had moved quickly thanks to Mr. Johnson's determination. Surveillance footage from the store coupled with the police body cam recordings left no doubt about what had occurred. The evidence was damning. The video captured everything, from the moment Miss White struck Amelia, to the cruel accusations and false claims that followed. The charges against Miss White were severe: assaulting a minor, child endangerment, and filing a false police report. She had been denied bail, and her trial date arrived sooner than expected. Mr. Johnson had assembled a powerful legal team, determined to ensure that no detail was overlooked. He wasn't just seeking justice for Amelia. He was fighting to make sure no other child or family would ever have to endure the same cruelty. The store had undergone a transformation as well. Mr. Johnson implemented mandatory training on racial sensitivity and anti-discrimination policies for all employees. He made it clear that there would be no tolerance for prejudice of any kind. He personally oversaw the retraining sessions, ensuring his team understood the gravity of what had occurred and the importance of creating a welcoming, fair environment for everyone. Now, standing outside the courthouse, Mr. Johnson felt the weight of the last few weeks pressing heavily on him. The trial was about to begin, and Miss White was about to face the consequences of her actions. This wasn't just about her. It was about confronting the deeper systemic issues that had allowed such an incident to happen. Inside the courtroom, tension filled the air. Miss White sat at the defense table, her face pale and drawn. The confidence and arrogance she once displayed were gone, replaced by fear. She fidgeted nervously, glancing around the room as if searching for an escape, but there was none. The prosecutor laid out the case with precision, detailing Miss White's assault on Amelia and her false claims to the police. The jury listened intently, their faces growing graver as the evidence mounted. The surveillance footage was played, leaving no room for doubt about what had occurred. It was clear that Miss White's actions had been driven by malice, not fear. Amelia was spared from testifying, something Mr. Johnson had fought for. He didn't want his daughter reliving the trauma in front of strangers. Instead, the evidence spoke for her. Even the police officers admitted on the stand that they had acted too quickly, failing to investigate the situation properly. The trial moved swiftly. Miss White's attorney tried to argue that her actions were out of fear, but the jury was unconvinced. It was clear her actions were rooted in prejudice, and she had no justification for the harm she caused. And the jury returned with a guilty verdict on all counts. Relief washed over Mr. Johnson. Miss White was sentenced to several years in prison for her crimes. Justice had been served, though it didn't erase the pain of what Amelia had endured. As Mr. Johnson and Amelia exited the courthouse, they were met by a crowd of reporters and flashing cameras. Microphones were thrust toward him, but Mr. Johnson raised a hand, signaling for silence. "I have only one thing to say," he began, his voice strong and steady. "What happened to my daughter should never happen to anyone. This wasn't just an act of prejudice, it was an act of hatred. Today justice was served, but this isn't just about Miss White. It's about ensuring our society, our systems, and our communities refuse to tolerate discrimination in any form." He paused, looking down at Amelia, who stood beside him, her hand tightly gripping his. "This is for her," he continued, his voice softening, "and for every child who deserves to grow up in a world where they are judged by their actions and character, not the color of their skin." The murmurs of agreement from the reporters were a low hum as Mr. Johnson turned and walked away, Amelia by his side. As they reached their car, a sense of peace began to settle over him. He had fought for justice, and he had won. But more importantly, he had taken the first step toward creating a better future, not just for Amelia, but for all children. Amelia looked up at her father, her eyes reflecting a new sense of hope. "We're going to be okay, Daddy," she said softly. Mr. Johnson smiled down at her, his heart swelling with pride and determination. "Yes, baby girl," he replied. "We're going to be okay." For the first time since that terrible day, Mr. Johnson truly believed it. The future was uncertain, but together they would face it with strength, courage, and a renewed sense of purpose. Justice had been served, but the fight for equality was far from over. Mr. Johnson was ready to lead that fight, one step at a time. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. Let us know your thoughts and where you're watching from. Together, we can continue to inspire change.